Oh, hear me all right? Yeah? Okay? Great. So, normally it's interesting, I can talk for hours and hours about the topic that has been really the main focus of the last 15 years. By the way, what's that timer that we're meant to keep an eye on? Oh, there. I've just started here. But today I'm talking about something new. It's not new to me, but it's new for me to talk about it. So, I've got a little script. Which makes me feel a little uncomfortable, but that's okay. So, to begin with, what I'd like you to do, or I'd like to invite you to do, is to close your eyes and to take 3 long, deep breaths from your belly. Often we don't spend a lot of time coming inwards. We spend a lot of time going outwards. And just notice immediately what happens as soon as you bring your attention inwards, down to your true center, which is your navel. That's your anatomical center. And I'd like you to ask yourself the following question. Who am I? And just see what comes. And then ask yourself, what am I here on this planet to do? And just see what comes. Spontaneously. No trying. Just observe. And then take another couple of long, deep breaths. And open your eyes. And we're going to come back to this in a moment, but before we do that, I'd like to share a story. So when I was growing up, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was at school, I had no clue. Everybody else was choosing their careers and I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I just went to university because I enjoyed languages and I just didn't know what else to do. It came to the end of university, parents are saying, what are you going to do? I don't know. So I went up to London. I'm from England, you might have noticed. I went up to London and moved from one job to another, getting bored very quickly, still no idea what to do. Had some interesting jobs, had some boring jobs, but really, I can honestly say that I thought at that time in my 20s that the purpose of life was to go to school, go to university, meet someone, get married, have a job, not necessarily in that order, get married, have a house with a white picket fence, 2.2 children, maybe a dog, etc., etc. I really thought that was what life was about because nobody told me any different. And then something happened that changed all of that, although I didn't really come to understand what that was until many years later. And when I was 28, which by the way is Saturn return, when all your shit comes up to be faced, I didn't know that either at the time. I was unexpectedly diagnosed with depression. I'd never heard of the word at the time I was diagnosed. And several months later, found myself in hospital experiencing what is commonly called a nervous breakdown. Although nobody ever called it that, they just said I had depression, and I didn't even know it was that until many years later. But it actually began as I was sitting in my flat, on the stairs in my flat, and this was after many months of no light at the end of the tunnel, depression, and 3 days without food or sleep. And I was sitting on the steps in my flat, and I could feel this energy spiraling out of between my eyebrows. And I didn't really know what it was, but I was watching it, and I knew I had a choice. I had a choice to allow it to continue, or I could stop it. And I was absolutely terrified of allowing it to continue. I didn't know what was happening, but I stopped it and it spiraled back in. But even so, I was not in a good place. I was unable to cope with life. And on the advice of my counselor, I admitted myself into a very nice private mental institution. Sounds so horrible, doesn't it? Mental institution. It wasn't like that at all, actually. It was really nice. Well, it wasn't like what people think. So anyway, the doctors wanted to give me antidepressants, but after 2 days trying them, I felt 10 times worse, and I refused to take any more. And instead I retreated to my room, and they were trying to get me to go to art classes and craft classes, but I didn't want to do anything. I just wanted to lie in bed. I couldn't read, I couldn't watch television. My brain just had ceased functioning just about. And I would get up to go for meals, but apart from that, I just lay in the bed, sinking deeper and deeper into an endless abyss of darkness and depression, which seemed to have no end. And it was a very surreal and scary experience at the time. And I literally felt like I was losing my mind. And later I found out that actually I had, in a way, lost my mind, but in a good way. So at a certain point of sinking into the abyss, I kept on trying to pull myself out, thinking I should be pulling myself out, but I just gave up. One day I just gave up, and I decided I'd go fully in. And then miraculously, I started to come out the other side, like I was drilling down through the earth and coming out the other side. And I started to feel better, and within 2 weeks, I was able to leave the clinic. And on the train back to my flat, I was sitting there feeling like, this is really weird. I feel like a newborn baby, but I don't know why I feel like this. And again, I didn't really realize what had happened until many years later. But I started to get on with my life, and 9 months later, or a few months later, I emigrated to New Zealand with my then partner, and then spent the next year extricating myself from a toxic, abusive, emotionally, physically abusive relationship, which I didn't know I was in to begin with, as one doesn't, and then managed to extricate myself from that, another story. But it became clear that I was not a happy person, and I started to get into personal development in a big way. Fast forward, and after having retrained in the film and television industry, which had been my dream for many, many years, and I finally found the courage to follow it, I then found myself 12 months after starting this new career, diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. I just walked into work one day, I was absolutely exhausted, I couldn't go on, and I just quit on the spot, went home, went to the doctor, got diagnosed, you got chronic fatigue syndrome, there's no cure, there's no solution, go home and rest. So I sat on the couch for 3 months. The highlight of my day was watching The Love Boat. It was. And when the series finished, I sat there on the couch and I thought, well, what now? And I thought, I can't live the rest of my life like this. And I got very angry inside. There was something that stirred up inside, and it said, I will not spend the rest of my life like this. I don't know how I'm going to get well, but I will find a way. And it was a very, very strong and pivotal moment. And from that moment on, I started seeking and trying therapies. I tried hundreds of therapies, but after 5 years, I was still sick. And I, looking at the time, half the time's gone already. So after 5 years, still not better, cut a very long story short, asked myself, what would I do if I only had 6 months to live? And the answer was, well, even though you can hardly get out of bed sometimes, you do that trip around the world that you've got a whole filing drawer cabinet of brochures for, which I didn't even know why I was collecting them. But I decided, okay, I sold my house, it sold in 2 weeks, got myself ready, I set off around the world thinking this might be the last chance that I can ever do anything like this because I'm just not getting better. And that was a whole long story, but to cut a long story short, right at the end of that trip, I did find the answers. All the pieces of the puzzle to why I was ill came together, and a big part of it was unprocessed emotional hurts. Anyway, as I was, so then there was another 6 years of learning and implementing self-help techniques to get myself well, which I did, and then I started helping other people. But I had no idea on this whole journey to resolve my own health problems, which is where it started, depression, then chronic fatigue, and then a whole load of other things as well, a lot of other illnesses. The journey would lead me somewhere else entirely. And traditionally, this is called, you've probably heard of it, the bumblebee effect, or the law of precession, where you head in one direction and then you find the real destination is at 90 degrees to the goal. So what was it I began to discover? I began to learn the difference between what in Ren Shui we call the false self and the true self, or in the ageless wisdom tradition is called the fourth kingdom of humanity and the fifth kingdom of souls. So over the years, I've been infinitely fortunate to have found my way to many wise teachers each of whom has brought me closer to discovering these truths. And I've been fascinated by the information, and the truth is that really right now it is my reason for living. It's what makes life worthwhile to understand this much bigger perspective of what is life about. And I began to understand that the experience I'd gone through in the hospital had been a mental breakdown, but what that really meant was it was a breakdown of my old mental concepts. And I literally felt like if you could say my mind was a skyscraper that had been demolished, and it was just this mess of rubble, but it had to be demolished for a new skyscraper to be built. And that was why I felt like a newborn baby coming home on the train that day. So in 2004, I started practicing Kriya Yoga, which is the yoga written about by Paramahansa Yogananda in the book Autobiography of a Yogi, which is a quite well-known book. And that was my first introduction to the topic of self-realization and enlightenment. And I was fascinated, very fascinated, although I didn't really understand much about it. And simultaneously, I'd started training in Qigong, and in 2009 met a true master of wisdom who I knew was the teacher I'd been seeking. I immediately joined his teacher training, and in 2012 he embarked on a new 6-year teacher training program. And little did we know that we were learning the philosophies and strategies for a clear path for reaching what is commonly called realization or enlightenment. And instead of the goal being a distant dream in some future life, which I'd always thought to myself, well, another 5 lives in the future, I became aware that not only was it more possible than I'd ever imagined to either reach or come closer to the goal in this life, but also I became very aware of the absolute necessity to do so. And not just for me, but for humanity as a whole. So as we've learned through this training, the real goal of self-realization is not the attainment itself, but the consequences of the goal, again, the processional effect, which are the states of wisdom which bring with them the ability to think and act from a place of universal unification, which is beyond the mind and which cannot be grasped by the mind, and which is commonly called self-realization or oneness. There are many different terms according to what school of wisdom one is with. So when we're operating from this place of wisdom, there can be no harm, because harming another is harming oneself. And when enough of humanity are operating from this level of consciousness, which lies beyond normal cognition and cannot be grasped by the mind, no matter how hard you try, then the whole game of life changes. As my teacher says, your whole life begins anew. We can no longer act out of selfishness, we can no longer harm one another or nature or the environment, because we've transcended separative personality consciousness to become group soul consciousness. So from the way I see life at the moment, humanity is at a crossroads, we are in crisis, and from what I've learned from my wise teachers, the solution lies within each of us to evolve our own consciousness beyond the personality to greater levels of self-realization and wisdom, so that we think, behave, and act completely differently, and that is how we save ourselves and the planet. So to finish with, I invite you again to close your eyes. I know I've spoken very fast. Take 3 long deep breaths from your belly. This time, go into your heart. Come into your heart, which is the gateway to the soul. And I'm going to lead you very quickly through the 5 qualities of the heart consciousness, which is starting with trust, feeling trust in your heart, which allows the heart to open wider, which then allows you to feel love and gratitude, and a Chinese term called gongjing, which is really respect but also humility. Just feel those qualities in your heart as a gateway to the soul.